Mentioned these two chasing each other just off the southeast coast of Australia as we speak. And a great view of that center screen there where you're seeing Dragon lining itself up with the International Space Station and the views that both pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO and Peggy Whitson, commander of Axiom Mission 4, are monitoring. Now approaching about 31 minutes until we reach waypoint 1. And once the spacecraft reaches waypoint 1, it'll be about 220 meters away, a little more than 656 feet from the orbiting laboratory, is Dragon Grace on its inaugural flight, looking to connect up to the International Space Station. Before we reach waypoint 1, which will be in about 30 minutes from now, the teams here on the ground, about 10 minutes outside of that milestone, will conduct a go, no-go poll, which we've been talking about throughout today's broadcast, just that step-by-step process, that slow and steady methodical maneuvering of the spacecraft to connect to the orbiting laboratory. And we're continuing to follow along for an approximate docking time of 5:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern. And the only light you're seeing from that shot was bouncing off of the International Space Station and what it provided, but now inside Dragon Grace and its Axiom Mission 4 crew of Peggy Whitson, commander, Shubhanshu Shukla, pilot. That's who you see in the field of view there, just that over-the-shoulder shot as they monitor Dragon's maneuvering towards the space station, but also joined alongside by mission specialist Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski and Tibor Kapu, respectively, of ESA and Hunor. And as we continue to take a look at the orbital nighttime phasing of the International Space Station and the Dragon Grace spacecraft, you see those thruster firings continuing that methodical approach for the craft, but you can also see in that left-hand side the speed of which they are traveling, the Dragon spacecraft at that, as it makes, again, it's starting to steady out in that slow push towards the orbiting laboratory, 428 kilometers above Earth. Once aboard the orbiting laboratory, the Axiom Mission 4 crew will participate in about 60 research investigations representing 31 countries, and more than 24 of those experiments supported by the ISS National Laboratory. And there's a live look at the teams here on the ground. On the left-hand side, that is Mission Control in SpaceX, Hawthorne, California, following along with Dragon's progress, I should say. And on the right-hand side, it looks to be Axiom Space here in Houston, just down the road from Johnson Space Center, NASA's Johnson Space Center, where we are located. In the International Space Station Flight Control Room, all three teams working together in integrated operations. That began just before we went live for today's broadcast. We're all three monitoring the progress of the Dragon spacecraft to the International Space Station. And you've been hearing communications on what is the big loop, which is that single line of comms that allow for the Dragon spacecraft and Grace to communicate with the International Space Station, but also for the teams on the ground here in Houston and in California and Hawthorne, all to communicate together. So everybody on the same page as the spacecraft continues its push towards the orbiting lab. We are about 26 minutes away, a little bit north of that, until we reach waypoint 1 for Dragon Grace. As you can see, some of that telemetry and data populating the screens inside of the spacecraft that the team on board are carefully monitoring. And this is the view from the Dragon spacecraft looking up at the International Space Station, as these two now making their way into the southernmost regions of the Pacific Ocean, having just passed underneath the south and then the southeast of Australia. They will continue into an orbital nighttime period until they reach roughly about the east coast of North America, and then you'll get some of those great views of the sunlight radiating over top of both of the craft. So far, everything performing nominally for the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft as it continues its push towards the International Space Station, and what's been quite the journey for them. You heard earlier that this, since launch all the way up to the anticipated docking time, will be about a 28-hour process, 28, 29 hours or so. So a lot has happened in a short amount of time as the teams in Hawthorne, California on the left and the teams on the right-hand side in Axiom Space working together with those here in Houston. And those teams right now communicating with each other on those internal communications loops that we monitor and follow along with as they now prepare the teams for waypoint 1 about 24 minutes from now. The go no go for that will be in about 15 minutes or so. And we'll keep an ear out for those comms as, again, Dragon starting to slow down its approach towards the International Space Station, a very methodical journey that all started shortly after launch, what was yesterday morning at 1:31 a.m. Central Time, 2:31 a.m. Eastern. That saw the Axiom mission for Team reach orbit and begin its journey to track down the International Space Station, the fourth private astronaut mission and the first since January of 2024, when Axiom Mission 3 would join the expedition aboard the orbiting laboratory. On board the International Space Station, the crews, they were up and got right into preparing for Dragon's arrival. NASA's Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, who you've heard at times on the big communications loop talking to all parties. They are in the station's cupola using specialized software to track Dragon's approach and making sure it stays in the expected zones with that orbital nighttime currently enveloping the station and the Dragon spacecraft. They're keeping a close eye, and of course from the space station perspective, and we'll see it as we receive video communication, that strobing effect, that strobe light on the front, and that forward nose cone of the SpaceX Dragon to help illuminate its path and help keep track. Earlier, we also received that as the Dragon spacecraft makes its way towards waypoint 1 about 22 minutes from now, that the teams on the ground were looking to bypass this milestone, but will again do a go, no go poll, make sure everything looks exactly as it should before allowing that bypass of the spacecraft, and then its maneuver up and over top of the International Space Station, and then proceeding onto waypoint 2. And a great graphic of the International Space Station, and just below it, the Dragon spacecraft is, again, they are making their journey across the Pacific Ocean, traveling over 26,000 kilometers an hour and 420 plus kilometers above the Earth's surface. We've been talking about that methodical approach for the Dragon spacecraft that started immediately, or 45 minutes or so immediately after launch yesterday morning, in which they would execute a series of burns from the phase burn to the boost burn, co-elliptic, or close burn, transfer, and co-elliptic burn. Those 5 burns allow for the stair-stepping of Dragon to climb up in altitude, but also to close the gap, the distance between the International Space Station and the spacecraft itself. And that is what's led us up to this morning. The approach initiation burn started just shortly after the start of this broadcast, in which Dragon, in integrated operations with SpaceX and NASA working together with Axiom Space, all monitoring closely as Dragon Grace continues its way towards the orbiting lab, and looking to turn a crew, the Expedition 73 crew of 7, into a total of 11, a full house above the orbiting lab. Now inside 20 minutes to the waypoint 1 arrival. And about 10 minutes or so, the teams here inside Houston, as well as and SpaceX in Hawthorne, California, will continue to monitor and do the go, no go for waypoint 1. And if everything is on track, they'll continue to proceed through waypoint 1 onto waypoint 2. And waypoint 2 has them right on the doorstep of the International Space Station, about 20 meters out when they arrive to that waypoint, a little more than 65 feet away. If you are just joining us, we are continuing to follow along the progress of Axiom Mission 4 and the 4 astronauts aboard: Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubhanshu Shukla, and mission specialists Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski and Tibor Kapu. The 4th private astronaut mission, and the first since January 2024, to make its way towards the International Space Station, in which they will spend approximately 2 weeks doing research investigations and outreach activities, expanding commercial space. We are tracking a docking time of approximately 5:18 a.m. Central Time, 6:18 a.m. Eastern. The next key milestone that we are keeping an eye on is the arrival of the spacecraft to waypoint 1. And to gain perspective, waypoint 1 will be about 220 meters away between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. And that's the second checkpoint. They have already reached waypoint 0 to begin this process. Waypoint 0, waypoint 1, and then on to waypoint 2, which we mentioned is about 20 meters away.
Okay, just very set down.
Great views there from the International Space Station, looking at the Dragon Grace spacecraft, that strobe light illuminating its path, as well as the port and starboard side lights. The red and green that you see on your screen is both the International Space Station and Dragon Grace in an orbital nighttime period. They're actually crossing over the Pacific Ocean, about to cross over the equator, and then eventually make its way over the west coast of North America. We'll start to see the spacecraft and the International Space Station once again become illuminated with an orbital sunrise. In a few more moments, that'll occur as they continue their journey over the Pacific Ocean. And for the Dragon spacecraft, approaching waypoint 1, now about 15 minutes from that point. And we'll continue to bring those great views as you see that slow and steady progress of the Dragon vehicle as it continues to track down the orbiting laboratory. And on your screen, you see the speed and altitude, where it is in over the Earth in current relation. But on that far right-hand side, that's the thruster firings. And you just see those illuminate every so often as Dragon continues to fine-tune its path towards the International Space Station. And this mission since launch approaching now 1 day, 3 hours or 3.5 hours of time. That's the time you see in the middle there, the T plus. 1 day, 3 hours, 28 minutes and 40 plus seconds. As the crew aboard, anxious and ready to join the Expedition 73 crew aboard the International Space Station. And as we take a look at those crew members and introduce them to you, that'll welcome the Axiom Mission 4 team. They are led by Commander Takuya Onishi of JAXA, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, who just recently celebrated about 2 weeks ago his 200 days in space. Anne McLean, NASA flight engineer, will be there as well. Her and Nicole Ayers, the two NASA astronauts monitoring Dragon's approach to the International Space Station. For McLean, celebrating 300 days in space last week. And for Nicole Ayers, this past Monday, celebrated 100 days in microgravity. They're also joined by NASA astronaut Johnny Kim, flight engineer, and Roscosmos cosmonauts Kirill Peskov. For Peskov, he would also celebrate 100 days this past Monday as a part of the Crew at 10 team. And then Roscosmos cosmonauts Sergei Ryzhikov and Alexei Zubritsky also joining the cadre of 7 astronauts and cosmonauts aboard the International Space Station. We mentioned earlier this is the 4th private astronaut mission to the International Space Station, and the first since January of 2024, since Axiom Mission 3. From the Axiom Mission 1 now through Axiom Mission 4, the International Space Station will have welcomed 14 different private astronaut crew members representing 111 different nations, and showcasing how these private astronaut missions truly expand access to the space station for more nations, people, and opportunities. And we talked about this crew, in approximately their 2 weeks on board the orbiting laboratory, will participate in around 60 research investigations. This is Mission Control Houston as we are continuing to monitor the Dragon Grace spacecraft and Axiom mission for the private astronaut mission as it continues its approach to the International Space Station. They have continues its approach to the International Space Station. They have moved past waypoint 0 and are now on its way to waypoint 1, the second of 3 checkpoints or 3 gates. Approximately 5:30 a.m. Central Time, 6:30 a.m. Eastern, as the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Eastern, as the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station team control room continuing to work together in communication and relay those updated data and projections and trajectory and all the information needed. So again, that docking time has been updated to now approximately 5:30 a.m. Central. And listening in on the loops on overall communications have just pulled go for Dragon's approach to waypoint 1, and they will reach that milestone waypoint 1 in about 9 minutes from now. Space station, a little more than 656 feet. And once it reaches that docking access, an additional, and given the go there, Dragon Grace will move to within 20 meters and a little more than 65. And earlier we also had communications that if everything goes 0 to waypoint 2, but once it arrives to waypoint 1, this will be the point in the spacecraft's journey in which we will be on what we call the docking axis, which will essentially mean that it is directly in front of the docking port that it'll connect itself to. The crew are right now heading to the space-facing port on the International Space Station, node to zenith. So its journey brings it from underneath the International Space Station, Dragon Grace, to swinging up and over top of it, and then arriving at that docking access en route to waypoint 2. We'll continue to bring views of the International Space Station and Dragon Grace as they're now making their way towards the western coast of North America in an orbital nighttime configuration. And we've seen as it gets closer, it'll actually illuminate the International Space Station and allow for greater views of the docking port itself, that it'll connect that anticipated docking time that has now recently been updated to 5. Teams on the ground have pulled go for inside Dragon International Space Station, and there you see it, the view from the orbiting laboratory, looking at Dragon Grace, as you see that strobe light we were just mentioning, as in green. And that extra layer of protection and pressure, and that happens. The International Space Station, they'll be crew members, and the Crew 10 National Space Station in early April. And then 2 cargo craft, Progress cargo craft from Roscosmos also aboard the station, and then eventually Commander Peggy Whitson and pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO. And you see them adjusting their monitors as the approach continues on for Dragon, and then a great view in the middle of the screen there of the path Dragon is taking. Last time we saw inside, it was more towards the left-hand side of the screen, in which Dragon now flying up and over top of the International Space Station. And now we get great views from Dragon Grace, and there's the strobe light. You can see it ever so faintly illuminating the International Space Station as it continues.
Station Houston on the big loop. Dragon is transmitting docking camera video. Please confirm video and data updating in Dragon Docking Monitor. Also, we have a new docking time of 10:30.
Houston copies. We are seeing data on the Dragon docking monitor, and we copy 10:30 for the new docking time.
Houston copies.
Great communications there on the big loop between the teams in Houston and SpaceX, talking to Dragon Grace and the confirmations of the updated docking time. You heard the words 10:30. That's 10:30 Zulu, which Central Time is 5:30, as we had mentioned, 5:30 a.m. Central, 6:30 a.m. Eastern, as we return to that exciting view from Dragon looking up at the International Space Station. You can ever so faintly see the solar arrays coming into view, and that strobe light illuminating the radiators, which are right along that central portion and angling upward. The International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft now approaching the west coast of North America, right around the Seattle area, that border between the United States and Canada, as we are approaching 1 minute away from waypoint 1, the second checkpoint and second series of waypoints for the spacecraft to reach to. The teams have already pulled go, but we will listen for the call outs for that waypoint 1 arrival.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, approach 1 and soft capture ring extension will begin shortly. Dragon will continue approach to waypoint 2. As a reminder, manual impulsive.
Capture ring, and that is the initial contact that will occur between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station, a soft capture, with that soft capture ring then retracting and the 12 hooks that will drive and connect and form a hard mate between the spacecraft and the International Space Station. From there, power communications will then be connected up, and astronaut Nicole Ayers will make her way into the pressurized mating adapter and get ready for hatch opening procedures, which will require bringing the vestibule, the space between the two hatches, between the International Space Station and Dragon Grace, together. And there we see the orbital sunrise making its way over top of the International Space Station as they continue their pursuit of each other, now angling over at North America. And there in the center screen, if you look at the topmost, the Dragon now perfectly aligned over top of the International Space Station, now looking down at that Node 2 Zenith port, and a great view just off the bottom portion there. That is the Dragon Endurance spacecraft that it'll be just alongside of. So Dragon has reached waypoint 0, and on initial comms earlier that the teams on the ground, once reaching waypoint 1, have been allowed to bypass that waypoint and now move on to waypoint 2, which will be in about 9 minutes from now, and targeting docking in about 14.5 minutes from there. Go, no-go polls for docking in about 7 minutes as the teams on the ground continuing to monitor Dragon's progress. And once they arrive to waypoint 2, there will be a pause, make sure everything is lined up just perfectly before that final approach and docking. This is Mission Control Houston as Dragon Grace and the spacecraft carrying Axiom Mission 4 and their 4 astronauts continuing their approach to the International Space Station. They have just made their way past waypoint 1, which had them at 220 meters away from the space-facing port of the International Space Station's Harmony module. And now on the path to reach waypoint 2, teams on the ground have concurred or agreed that they will take a brief pause at waypoint 2, which is 20 meters away, to make sure everything is aligned precisely. And there you see the view from Dragon and that newly illuminated International Space Station as the two craft navigating its way over North America, coming into an orbital sunrise and daytime period.
Station on the big loop. Dragon attitude is still as expected, and station is ready for docking.
Houston copies. At waypoint 2, Dragon will briefly pause to align for docking, then automatically resume approach.
Houston copies.
Commentator Rob.
You just heard great communications on the big loop from Station and Dragon, as well as the teams in Houston and in Hawthorne for SpaceX and NASA, as the Dragon Grace spacecraft continuing its approach to the International Space Station, carrying Axiom Mission 4 Commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA,
Dragon
and
SpaceX
Tibor.
Soft capture ring extension complete. Dragon will continue through waypoint 2 without a hold.
Second copies, no hold at waypoint 2, and good rating extension.
Great communications there. They were anticipating a brief hold to make sure everything aligns, but Dragon Grace continuing need to continue past waypoint 2. And you also heard in the communications with NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers, the station ready for docking. And a great view of the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft making its glacial approach to the International Space Station, and the view from the space station looking up as it approaches the space-facing or Node 2 zenith port of the Harmony module. We are about 4 minutes away from the waypoint 2 arrival, which again, they are expecting to move right past through without a hold. That is at the 20-meter mark, and proceed right on into docking, a soft capture, and then soft capture ring retraction and hooks to drive. And that capture, about
Dragon
8 minutes
SpaceX
and 47.
on the big loop, ground is go for approach 2, and approach is now allowed. Reminder, ensure that visors are closed prior to Dragon's departure from the waypoint. Once Dragon is inside the crew hands-off point, retreat and breakout are not permitted.
Dragon copies, and we have visors down, and we are go for docking as well. And copy on the approach. Inside 2, stop.
SpaceX copies, visors down. SpaceX crew is go for docking.
All great communications there as the communications from the ground up to the SpaceX Dragon Grace spacecraft as visors are down on the 4 astronauts inside as they continue their approach to the International Space Station, now nearly 7 minutes away from that initial contact. Dragon and the International Space Station now making its way over the northernmost territories of North America and Canada and heading towards the Atlantic Ocean as we are now 7.5 minutes away from the approximate docking time as Dragon will move smoothly past waypoint 2, about 20 meters away. And continuing its fine-tuning and approach, you see little plumes coming off the spacecraft. Again, those are those thruster firings continuing to inch and adjust the spacecraft towards the orbiting laboratory. Dragon continuing to get bigger and bigger from the viewpoint of the International Space Station as waypoint 2 about 90 seconds away, and there it'll be just a mere 20 meters away. And there the spacecraft will focus on aligning its docking system with the docking adapter and then fly in to make the initial contact and give us what we will call that soft capture, or the soft capture ring will retract. And then the hooks will drive to form the hard mate. And that capture, or that initial contact, coming in about 6 minutes from now. Approaching 30 seconds away from waypoint 2 arrival, in which the Dragon spacecraft will be about 20 meters away, just called out 30 meters, so continuing its close in to the International Space Station. Dragon Grace now 25 meters away. Dragon has now reached waypoint 2, 20 meters away from the International Space Station, and will continue its approach to the International Space Station. And there you can see a great view of that zenith port, that space-facing port of the International Space Station's Harmony module. As the Dragon spacecraft right now sitting at waypoint 2, just 20 meters away.
Houston station per step 4 in block Bravo. Dragon attitude is as expected.
Houston copies. Station Houston on the Big Loop. Dragon is on final approach and is go for docking. Monitor per steps 5 and 6 and 1.102.
Station copies. Monitoring per steps 5 and 6.
And there you heard it. The final steps relayed up to the crew for final approach and docking have been given as we continue to see Dragon Grace spacecraft close the gap between them and the International Space Station. Now, just before the spacecraft reaches the international docking adapter for that soft capture, you'll hear the call out CHOP, or crew hands off point, which Dragon will continue its journey and make that initial connection, that soft capture, in those final few moments.
Dragon, 10 meters.
10 meters.
Inside 10 meters, a little less now than 30 feet away, is all that separates Dragon Grace from the International Space Station.
Five meters.
5 meters.
Meters, CHOP.
2
Houston
meters.
Station, 2 meters, CHOP.
We have CHOP.
1 meter.
1 meter. Dragon contact and soft capture complete.
Dragon copy.
Dragon Grace and the Axiom Mission 4 crew have arrived to the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time over the North Atlantic as the two orbiting around the Earth, connecting with the soft capture ring, and now we'll begin the ring retraction to bring the two vehicles closer together, and then the 12 hooks, the two sets of 6, will drive to form a hard nut. And there you heard there, the soft capture ring is retracting, and then we'll do so until sensors are indicating it's time for those hooks to drive in place and give us a hard capture and firmly secure Dragon to station. And again, Axiom Mission 4 and its commander Peggy Whitson, pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO, and mission specialist Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski and Tibor Kapu of ESA and Hunor have arrived to the International Space Station with contact at 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern, as the two were orbiting over the North Atlantic. The soft capture ring, that initial contact between Dragon Grace and the International Space Station, continuing to retract, and we'll await for the calls that the sensors read that it'll be time for those 12 hooks on the Dragon to then begin driving and connecting itself to form a hard mate to the International Space Station.
Ring retraction complete. Docking sequence is holding for MCS reconfiguration.
This is Mission Control Houston, as you are seeing a live view of the recently connected Dragon Grace spacecraft with the Axiom Mission 4 astronauts and Peggy Whitson, Shubhanshu Shukla, Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski, and Tibor Kapu arrive to the International Space Station, soft capture and contact at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, 6:31 a.m. Eastern, as the two were orbiting above the North Atlantic. And right now, the two mated with that soft capture, the soft capture ring retracting to pull the spacecraft closer to the International Space Station. And once given the go, the ring or the hooks around the Dragon nose cone will drive and connect to form a hard mate. Teams on the ground in both Houston.
Station Houston on the big loop. MCS configured, proceeding with hook driving.
Station copies.
And the great call there, that's the next step in this docking procedure, is the driving of the hooks, the 12 hooks surrounding the nose cone or the nose of the Dragon spacecraft. And we'll monitor those. They'll drive in 2 sets of 6. The first set of 6 right now, they're traveling, and we'll continue to follow along as the docking process continues on. And then after that first set of 6, the second set will drive and connect Dragon to form a hard mate to the International Space Station. And once the docking is complete, NASA astronauts Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, who have been monitoring from the International Space Station from the cupola of the Dragon's arrival, it'll be Ayers that'll begin the hatch opening or hatch operations. And that'll start by opening up the main hatch on the Node 2 Zenith section of the Harmony module. That's what you see Dragon connected to. And what's separating that module and the Dragon spacecraft is that and continuing to monitor that first set of 6 hooks forming that hard mate. And once the full set of 12, Ayers will continue the docking procedures with the leak checks and then begin making its way into the pressurized mating adapter. That's what you see between the Harmony module and the Dragon spacecraft, and access into there to then what we begin pressurizing the vestibule, that small compartment between the 2 hatches. And that vestibule has been exposed to the vacuum of space prior to Dragon Grace's arrival. So the next step is to carefully reintroduce that air and pressure inside so it matches both that of the station and the Dragon spacecraft. And we just received confirmation that the first set of 6 hooks have driven and closed, and we'll now begin the second set of 6 to continue that hard mate between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. If you are just joining us, this is Mission Control Houston, where Axiom Mission 4 aboard the Dragon Grace spacecraft have connected to the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time, currently in the process from soft capture to the hard mate to the orbiting laboratory. First set of 6 hooks have closed, and now monitoring that second set of 6, 12 in total, to form that hard mate.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, hard capture complete.
Dragon copies. Hard capture complete.
And we just heard confirmation there. All 12 hooks have closed, and that is a hard mate to the Dragon Grace spacecraft and the International Space Station, completing from soft capture to that hard mate. And these So the soft capture ring retraction in progress, and then it'll be on to establishing umbilical connections between the spacecraft and the International Space Station. That'll allow for the transfer of communications and power through those umbilicals. So where Dragon, you see that upper portion that's mostly black against the vacuum of space, but that's the solar arrays to provide Dragon power. Once those umbilicals are connected, that power will then be provided by the International Space Station, and communications will have that hardline connection with the umbilicals as well. And once those umbilicals have been connected, that'll complete the docking process, and that's when NASA astronauts Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, namely Ayers, will jump into action and begin the leak checks and hatch opening procedures. And that'll allow the pressurization of the vestibule, the space between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station, to be brought to pressure equal to that of what is inside the station and inside the Dragon spacecraft, about 14 psi, what you experience here on Earth as sea level. And then from there, the hatch operations will continue. And the Axiom Mission 4 team will make its way on board the International Space Station with welcome remarks soon to follow. Soft capture ring has now been stowed away, and the umbilicals are in motion again to connect Dragon Grace and the International Space Station, providing that communications, that direct line of communications and power.
Dragon SpaceX on the Big Loop, docking sequence complete. Ground will be enabling hardline power and comm connections shortly. You are go to DOS suits per procedure 4.012 and begin post-docking cabin configuration per 4.400 in parallel.
Kentucky, docking complete, 4.012 and 4.400 are in work, and Grace is happy to be on Harmony.
Grace Station, we are excited to welcome you. Peggy, Shug, Suave, and Tibor, we cannot wait to open the hatch and give you guys a hug. We'll see you soon.
Looking forward to it.
And Axiom 4 from Houston, welcome aboard the International Space Station. It's an honor to have you join our outpost of international cooperation and exploration.
We are honored to be here. Thank you.
Very exciting moment for all those aboard. Hawthorne, California, and SpaceX as Axiom Mission 4, the private astronaut mission with Peggy Whitson, who you just heard talking on the Big Loop, the single line of communications between all four parties, sharing her excitement as she returns to the International Space Station, bringing up first-time flyers and pilot Shubhanshu Shukla of ISRO and mission specialist Sławosz Uznański-Wiśniewski of ESA and Tibor Kapu of Hunor. Contact between the two, between Dragon Grace and the International Space Station at 5:31 a.m. Central Time. And now that the hooks have connected, all 12, and umbilicals deployed, providing power and communications. Now the team inside the International Space Station, namely Nicole Ayers, is going to start beginning the hatch opening procedures. And now that we're docked, she will secure some hardware and then move right into those operations. And first we'll open the large hatch at the Node 2 Zenith, or the space-facing port side of the Harmony module. And that's what you see, similar to where that NASA logo is. That's the Harmony module that the pressurized mating adapter is jettisoning up into and connecting to the Dragon Grace spacecraft. And then from there, she'll traverse into that pressurized mating adapter, and we'll begin pressurizing the vestibule, which is that small space between the hatches on Dragon and the space station. And we have talked about this has been exposed to vacuum prior to docking, and we'll need to fill that space with air to make sure that pressure is equal with the atmospheric pressures on Dragon and the International Space Station. Also putting away some hardware in the process, including the docking cross. And Ayers will use a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce that air into the vestibule. And flight controllers here in Houston will continue to monitor the pressure and temperature readings inside and verify that everything is A-OK and leak-free before we get ready to open up the hatches. From that capture moment, which again was 5:31 a.m. Central, 6:31 a.m. Eastern over the North Atlantic. It takes roughly about 2 hours to get everything pressurized and checked out before we open up the hatches and welcome in Axiom Mission 4 to the International Space Station.
Commentator and producer
SpaceX Dragon on the big loop. Com check on the cabin mic.
Peggy, I have you loud and clear on the cabin mic on the big loop. Dragon, SpaceX on Dragon aground. That call on the cabin mic actually came over Dragon aground.
Thanks for the catch. We reconfigured.
This is Mission Control Houston as we continue to follow along the progress of